The porch light was still buzzing with moths when my sister zipped her suitcase shut and said the real reason for her smile out loud to a 10-year-old instead of to me. "Don't get too attached to her, Harper," she said, checking her lipstick in the hallway mirror instead of looking at either one of us. "When I get back, she won't be my responsibility anymore." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked a stray thread off Josie's sweater and said okay. Because 41 years in this family teaches you that the loudest reaction in the room is usually the wrong one. My name is Harper Voss, and this isn't a story about a fight I had with my sister. It's an accounting I finally got to finish. Before any of that, there's an older story running underneath it, the kind every family carries quietly beneath the newer ones. Dana is 2 years younger than me. Growing up outside Brainerd, we shared a bedroom and a dresser we never once split fairly. Our dad, Wayne, worked the grain elevator on the edge of town and died in an accident there when I was 9 and Dana was 7. And afterward, our mother, Carol, did what a lot of young widows in small towns did back then. She remarried inside of 2 years to a man who liked Dana's easy laugh a lot more than my quiet one, and the shape of that preference set itself into our family early and never really left. I'm not telling you this to make excuses for what came later. I'm telling you because by the time Dana stood in that hallway with her suitcase, we already had 34 years of practice at this particular arrangement. The part of my life that had nothing to do with Dana ran alongside all of that, the way lives do. I was married for 11 years to a man named Curtis, and we had one daughter, Mia, who's 26 now and living outside Tucson doing something with solar logistics I still can't fully explain no matter how many times she walks me through it on the phone. Curtis and I split up when Mia was 16, amicably enough as those things go, and I kept the house on Birchwood Lane and started doing part-time bookkeeping for 3 or 4 small businesses around Nisswa to make the numbers work. One of those businesses was a marina at the end of a gravel road, run by a man named Gary Lindqvist, who happened to be married to my sister. The marina smelled like 2-stroke oil and the inside of a Skoal tin, and Gary kept every receipt in a coffee can labeled important, do not throw. For 6 years, I did his books on Sunday nights at his kitchen table, a calculator in one hand and a glass of orange juice in the other, while his daughter Josie colored at the other end of the table and asked me every single week if 7 times 8 was really 56, or if I was just saying that to sound smart. She was 7 when she started asking. She kept asking until she turned 9 and finally decided to believe me. In the winters, Gary ran a little side business, renting out Coleman lanterns and tip-ups to the ice fishing crowd, and Josie had her own kid-sized bucket seat out on the lake by the time she was 5, bundled up like a marshmallow in 3 coats, waiting for a flag to pop while her dad drank coffee out of a thermos older than I was. Sundays after the potluck at the Lutheran church down the road, the 3 of us, sometimes 4 once Mia was old enough to tag along before she moved out west, would sit around that kitchen table until the light went orange through the window over the sink. And nobody in that house ever once made me feel like a spare part. That's the piece I have to hold on to now, because it's easy to let the ending of a story swallow up everything that came before it, and I'm not going to let that happen here. Gary died on a Friday night in November, alone at the marina, closing up the bait cooler after the last ice fishing rush of the season. A customer found him behind the counter at 6:40 the next morning. Heart, the doctor said, the kind that stops without asking anybody's permission first. He was 49. Between the life insurance and the sale of the marina property, it came to just over $340,000, put into a trust for Josie until she turned 18, with the bank required to co-sign anything over $2,000 a month, so the principal would still be there for college. Dana became her guardian, which nobody questioned, because nobody questions the surviving spouse in a situation like that, and I certainly didn't think to at the time. I remember standing at the funeral reception in the VFW hall, holding a paper plate of ham sandwiches, when a neighbor asked Dana how she and Josie were going to manage. Dana said it flat, like she was reading off a grocery list, refilling her coffee the whole time she said it. She'll adjust. Kids are resilient. It's not like Gary left much anyway. I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say out loud at your husband's funeral, with the man's own daughter 12 feet away eating a cookie off a paper napkin, but I filed it under grief making people say strange things because that's what I always did with Dana's strange things. I filed them and moved on. I met Roy at that same reception, actually, which in hindsight should have told me something all by itself. He introduced himself as a friend from Dana's gym, shook my hand a beat too long, and told me, unprompted, that he did a little something with mortgages, nothing exciting. 6 weeks later, he was picking Josie up from school on the days Dana worked late. 9 months later, he'd moved into Gary's house, the one with Gary's boat still parked in the driveway under a blue tarp nobody ever pulled off again. Looking back, there were smaller signs before the big ones, the kind you only notice once you've got a reason to go looking. Roy started handling Dana's bills within 2 months of dating her, just to take the load off. He suggested, gently and more than once at family gatherings, that Josie call him something other than Roy, an idea Josie flatly refused every single time without ever quite explaining why, which I now understand was its own kind of instinct working correctly long before any of us adults caught up to it. I noticed these things and did what I always did with things involving my sister. I filed them and moved on. Within a year, there was a new SUV parked next to that boat, and Dana was telling anyone who'd listen about an in-ground pool she was pricing out at $42,000, financing details included, whether you'd asked her or not. 3 weeks after the funeral, Dana called me on a Tuesday evening and told me she'd decided to simplify things and would be handling the books herself from now on, that it felt like something she needed to do for Gary. I said that sounded reasonable. I didn't ask why a woman who'd never once balanced her own checkbook in 30 years suddenly wanted to hand manage a $250,000 trust. I told myself none of it was my business. I told myself that for 2 years, which is its own kind of quiet and not the good kind. I should say, since I'm not interested in coming out of this looking better than I actually am, that I have a long history of telling myself things weren't my business where Dana's concerned, going back a lot further than Gary's funeral. When I was 11 and Dana was 9, she took apart the bike our stepdad had bought me for my birthday, not out of meanness exactly, more out of a kind of careless entitlement, looking for parts for her own bike, and when I cried about it, our mother told me I was being dramatic over metal. The bike never got fixed. I rode Dana's old one, the one with the bent kickstand, for 2 more years and never said another word about it. Then, when I was 34 and my transmission went out, I needed $600 I didn't have, and I called my sister, who was 3 days into a Royal Caribbean cruise that had cost somewhere around $3,000. She texted back, not really a good time, with a photo of a pie A tilde plus or minus A colada underneath it. I ate saltines with peanut butter for 8 straight days that month and told people at work I was doing a cleanse. That's the night I made myself a promise, quiet, the way the true ones usually are. Whatever else this family did to itself, I would never let it do the same thing to a kid. Not loud about it, just never again. So when Dana stood in that hallway 3 weeks ago with her suitcase and said what she said, and Roy carried the last bag out to the rental car without once looking at either of us, I already had that same old bad feeling sitting low in my stomach, the kind of feeling this family had trained into me over 3.5 decades. Then the door closed, the porch light kept buzzing, and Josie tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Aunt Harper, there's a secret I need to tell you." That week, I learned how a 10-year-old carries something too heavy for a 10-year-old to carry. She didn't hand it to me all at once. Kids never do. Sunday night, right after the door closed, all she managed was the sentence itself and then silent tears into my shoulder, and I told her whatever it was could wait until she was ready, that I wasn't going anywhere. Monday night it came sideways, over off-brand goldfish crackers at the counter. Mommy Dana and Roy do the grown-up talking with the door shut now. Tuesday, after a run to Culver's for concrete mixers, I found Daddy's tackle box in the garage. Nobody's looked in it but me. Wednesday night, after her bath, sitting on the edge of the tub in a towel with her hair still wet and a mosquito bite on one ankle she wouldn't stop scratching, she told me the rest, in the plain, matter-of-fact voice kids use for things that scare them too much for drama. Taped inside the lid of that tackle box, underneath the lures and a coffee-stained sticky note in her dad's handwriting, was an envelope with trust papers she didn't fully understand but had photographed anyway, on the old iPod he used to let her keep his fishing pictures on. The sticky note said, in Gary's blocky printing, Moan a circumflex euros drop ed. Paperwork at Lakeside. Ask Constance about the writer. He wrote it the Thursday before he died. And 2 nights before the Europe trip, hiding in the coat closet during a thunderstorm, Josie had heard Roy on the phone saying something about moving, the last of it, into the Lakeshore account before they got back, and Dana laughing and saying once Josie was off the books, none of it would matter anymore. I didn't gasp. I didn't call Dana screaming into a phone somewhere over the Atlantic. I said, "Okay, baby. Thank you for telling me," and I put her to bed with the nightlight on, and I did not let myself cry until I heard her breathing even out down the hall. Before I turned the light off, though, she said one more thing, quieter than everything else that night. Daddy used to say the tackle box was the one place nobody ever looks, because it's just boring hooks. She said it like she was proud of him for that, and a little sad, too, in the specific way 10-year-olds get sad, which is sideways and overfast and somehow more honest than the grown-up version. I told her he sounded like a smart man, and she said, "He was," in a voice that still had 6 years of certainty in it, and then she fell asleep before I'd even made it to the door. What I didn't know yet was that the amendment removing the bank's co-signature requirement, the one Dana had produced 3 weeks after Gary's funeral, was notarized 9 days before any date that sticky note in the tackle box could possibly make sense of. I understand now that Josie had been sitting on this, quietly testing which grown-up in her life might actually listen, for at least 4 months before she risked it on me. Looking back, it's strange what stays with you afterward. I can walk down a hardware store aisle today, catch one whiff of 2-stroke oil and old chewing tobacco, and be right back at that kitchen table with a calculator in my hand and orange juice going warm next to it. Thursday, Dana called from a hotel room in Amsterdam, and her voice had that bright, checking-a-box quality it always gets when she wants a witness to how good a mother she is without actually being asked. Is she eating? Is she being difficult? I said Josie was eating fine and being no trouble at all, which was true, and I didn't mention the tackle box, or the iPod, or the sticky note, because by then I already knew I needed more than a 10-year-old's memory and a bad feeling before I said a word out loud to my sister. That same afternoon, I drove past Gary's old marina on my way to pick Josie up from day camp, and for the first time in 2 years, I actually slowed down and looked at it instead of driving past out of habit. Then I turned the car around and drove 11 miles into town instead, straight to Lakeside State Bank. I sat down across from Constance Herrera, who'd known Gary since the two of them were in 4-H together as kids, and asked her, as casual as I could make my voice sound, whether the paperwork on file still matched what she remembered handling for him. Constance pulled the file, went quiet for a long minute, and said, "Harper, I need you to not touch anything on your end, and I need to make a call." By Friday afternoon, she'd brought in an attorney named Deb Okonkwo, who'd drawn up a will for me for free the year my divorce went through, back when I couldn't spare much more than gas money to get to her office. Deb set the amendment Dana had filed 3 weeks after Gary's funeral next to the bank's own time-stamped internal log, and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she told me the notarization date on the amendment was 9 days earlier than the date the bank system showed that account actually being modified, which meant one of those 2 dates was a lie, and paperwork doesn't usually lie by accident. Deb also mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd want to bring in a forensic document examiner to compare Gary's signature on the amendment against 3 verified samples from his actual handwriting, including the sticky note, just so the timeline would hold up if anyone ever tried to argue it in a courtroom instead of just a conference room. That Friday night, I called Mia in Tucson, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud to somebody who wasn't a lawyer or a 10-year-old, and my daughter, 26 years old and 3 time zones away, listened to the entire mess without interrupting once, then said, "Mom, you spent your whole life being the reasonable one in that family. Maybe reasonable finally gets to mean something." I've thought about that sentence more times in the 2 years since than I can count. Saturday, Josie asked me straight out, sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor, sorting through a box of Gary's old fishing lures we'd pulled down from a closet shelf. "Are we in trouble?" I told her no, that grown-ups were the only ones in trouble here, and that the bravest thing she'd ever done was tell me the truth even though nobody had asked her to. Deb had already told me, gently, that given the strength of the paper trail and the bank's own time-stamped records, There was a real chance Josie would never have to say a word of any of this to a judge, or a stranger with a badge, or anyone at all besides me. That mattered to me more than almost anything else in the whole mess. Whatever this family had already cost her, I wasn't going to let it cost her having to relive it out loud in front of people who'd never once shown up for her the way they should have. By Sunday morning at 9, with Dana and Roy's flight still 4 hours from landing, Deb had filed an emergency petition freezing what remained in that account. What remained, it turned out, was $61,400 out of the $340,000 that trust had started with 2 years earlier. Dana and Roy walked into a locked account, a subpoena headed toward the county's notary records, and me standing in Gary's driveway that evening next to his boat, still under its blue tarp. I'd left Josie with a neighbor down the road for the afternoon because whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to happen in front of a kid who'd already carried more of this than she should have had to. Dana's face did the thing it always does when she's caught, which isn't panic a circumflex euros, it's boredom, like the whole situation is beneath her instead of a threat to her. "This is insane, Harper," she said, setting her carry-on down like she still had somewhere better to be. "You always do this. Make something out of nothing." I handed her the folder Deb had put together, the amendment side by side with the time-stamped bank record, and watched her go quiet in a way I'd genuinely never seen before. Not rage, not tears. Just paperwork, spread out across the hood of her rental car like a losing hand nobody wanted to fold. Roy didn't say a word to either of us. He was already on his phone in the driveway, and I found out later he was calling a notary named Wanda Kepler, who'd done him a favor once before and was about to learn that favor had her own signature stamped on a fraud complaint now sitting in a county file. Dana kept saying, "We can fix this. We can talk to Constance together," as if the last 2 years hadn't already answered the question of who we was ever going to be in this situation. I told her Constance wasn't the one she needed to talk to anymore, and that I'd see her at the first hearing, whenever the court scheduled it. 2 days later, county investigators interviewed Dana and Roy separately, standard procedure Deb told me, and each of them, apparently, spent most of the interview pointing at the other one. Dana said the paperwork was basically Roy's department. Roy said he'd just helped file some things she asked him to. Neither version held up once the investigators laid it next to Wanda's own account of what actually happened. Here's the part I honestly didn't expect. Wanda came forward on her own 3 days after that, before anyone made her. She told the county attorney the truth. Roy had asked her to backdate a notarization for a friend's paperwork, and she hadn't looked closely enough at what she was putting her stamp on, and she was sorry in a plain, ordinary way Dana never once managed to be in front of me. Wanda lost her notary commission over it. She wasn't charged, because she cooperated fully, and because the dates she gave lined up exactly with a dead man's handwriting on a sticky note his own daughter had kept safer than any adult in her life had managed to. This isn't really a story about money, and it isn't really about Dana either. It's about a kid who did the math before a single grown-up around her bothered to. I think about that a lot, actually. The fact that the most reliable adult in this whole situation for the first several months was 10 years old and hiding in a coat closet during a thunderstorm, taking mental notes nobody asked her to take. The rest of it moved slower than the fights on television make it look. There were 4 separate hearings over 10 months, and I sat through every one of them in the same gray blazer, because Deb told me judges notice consistency more than people think. A guardian ad litem named Mr. Fenwick spent one afternoon at my kitchen table asking Josie easy, careful questions about her school and her room, and whether she felt safe. Nothing about tackle boxes or wire transfers at all, and told me afterward that in 11 years doing that job, it was one of the more straightforward reports he'd ever written. Guardianship transferred to me at the 3rd hearing, with Constance and a court-appointed co-trustee overseeing what remained until Josie turns 18. A receipt required for every dollar spent, exactly the way Gary had set it up the first time, before anyone got the idea to change it. Dana was never criminally charged, only hit with a civil judgment to repay what she and Roy had taken, a debt she's still paying off, $11 at a time, through wage garnishment. As of this recording, which feels like either a joke or a kind of justice, depending on which day you happen to catch me. Roy's mortgage license went up for review once the county's fraud referral landed on his employer's desk. And the last I heard, he was selling trucks 2 towns over and telling people the whole thing was Dana's idea. Maybe it was. It doesn't change what he did with his own 2 hands. At Thanksgiving that first year, half the family still sided with Dana, the way half a family always does at first, out of habit more than conviction. My Aunt Peg told me I was tearing this family apart over a bank account. I told her the tearing had already happened. I'd just been the one who finally said so out loud. My Uncle Ron, who hadn't said more than 10 words to me at a holiday table in a decade, pulled me aside by the coat closet and said, "I always figured something was off with that one. Should have said so years ago." I told him better late than never, and meant it more than it probably sounded. By the following spring, most of the rest of it had quieted down on its own, the way it tends to once people actually read the paperwork instead of just the family group chat. Our mother sent a Christmas card that year with an actual apology folded inside it, the first one I'd ever gotten from her in 41 years. "I should have said something when you were 11 and she took your bike apart for parts. I didn't. I'm sorry now." It wasn't everything. It was more than I'd ever expected to get from her, and I'll take more than expected over nothing every single time. Dana called me once, about 4 months after the judgment, wanting to talk about moving forward as a family. I told her I was glad to hear she was doing better, and that Josie was welcome to see her under whatever arrangement the court had already set, and that beyond that I didn't have anything else to give her right now. I didn't yell. I didn't hang up on her. I just said no, plainly, and didn't apologize for it, which might be the single hardest sentence I've ever said to my own sister. I'd be lying if I said no ugly part of me enjoyed watching Dana's hands shake while she scrolled through the county recorder's website that evening in the driveway, looking for a way out that had already closed. That part of me isn't something I'm proud of. I'm also not going to sit here and pretend it wasn't real. It's a regular Tuesday here now, 2 years later. Josie is 12, doing pre-algebra at my kitchen counter, the same counter Gary and I used to do his books on, and the chalkboard wall she begged me to paint down the hallway is covered edge to edge with equations and one very determined drawing of a golden retriever, which stopped being fictional last spring when we adopted an actual golden retriever from a shelter 40 minutes north and named him, at Josie's insistence, 7, because 7 times 8 is 56. And some jokes just belong to a family forever once they start. Last month, on a Saturday, Josie asked if we could take Gary's boat out, the one that had sat under that blue tarp for 4 years by then, and I called a man from the marina's old supplier list. And for $300, he had the engine running again inside a week. We didn't catch anything worth mentioning that first afternoon on the water, but Josie still asked, the exact same way she used to ask about 7 times 8, whether I thought her dad would be proud of her. And I told her the truth, which is that I don't think he ever stopped being proud of her for one single day, including the ones where none of us were paying close enough attention. I built a little mug shelf out of reclaimed pine last year, and Gary's old marina mug, chipped on the handle, sits right in the middle of it. The tomatoes out back came in late again this summer, but they came in. Every quarter, a check arrives for Josie's actual expenses, itemized and signed off by 2 people who have never once tried to hide a decimal point from each other. Never again. Turns out I meant it. So here's what I keep asking myself, and maybe you can answer it better than I've managed to. If a kid you loved whispered something like that to you in the dark, would you have believed her the first time, or would you have needed the tackle box, and the sticky note, and the bank statement, the way I did? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if this one landed somewhere honest, share it with the person in your family who spent their whole life keeping the peace instead of the truth. And hey, before you go back to your day, I know a lot of you are probably listening to this right now with one earbud in, staring at a spreadsheet, driving home, or maybe folding a mountain of laundry. But if this story made you pause your day for even just a second, hit that subscribe button. I'm Mrs. Stark, and here at Casterly Payback, we believe that karma always collects its debts down to the last penny. I'll see you in the next one.